This is a great opportunity for us because it is actually the first public lecture that we are doing this year, this semester, within the context of what we call the ALMA series, which is something that the ABI, the Arnold-Bergstraesser-Institut, has organized for a while as seminar series, as sort of a discussion and lecture format. Come in, you're welcome. But this is also part of the network, the Post-Colonial Hierarchies in Peace and Conflict Studies Network, which is an endeavor, an effort that we've been engaging in for just a year now. There are 4 institutions that are part of this network. One is the Arnold-Bergstraesser-Institut, the host for today. And the others are Marburg University, Erfurt University, and Bayreuth University. So I'm happy to see some of the colleagues from these institutions online as well. Great to have you. And this is why this is a hybrid lecture as well. So we will have part of this as a Zoom lecture. So this is being recorded as well. If there's anyone who would like to ask questions without being recorded, we can arrange that. And I will now just hand over to my colleague Benjamin Schütze, who will present Rafeef. Thank you very much for coming and for accepting the invitation, Rafeef. We're very happy to have you.
That's a double introduction. Yeah, it is my great pleasure to share a few introductory words with you about Dr. Rafeef Ziadah. Today's academic system basically has the tendency to produce scholars who primarily care about impact factors and the like, and much less so about actively engaging with the world around them and with ongoing systems of violent oppression. Rafeef, I think, is clearly not one of those. Besides being an outstanding academic and lecturer in politics and public policy at King's College in London, she's also a renowned spoken word artist and human rights activist. In her academic work, she primarily explores questions of infrastructure, gender, and race, with a particular focus on the Middle East and North Africa. Among her publications are excellent articles and books on settler colonialism and apartheid in Palestine, humanitarian logistics in the Arabian Gulf, and revolutionary feminisms, which also helped me personally quite a lot in my own work. So thanks a lot from my side also on that. Regarding her non-academic work, I would like to just briefly encourage you all to check out some of her extremely powerful poems and spoken word performances. In particular, her performance of We Teach Life, Sir, is truly amazing and both deeply emotional and political. So if you haven't listened to that yet, please Google it and do so. It's really great. Or in the words of US civil rights activist Angela Davis, I quote, "The words that she says with such beauty and grace hit you right in the heart. They are more powerful than any weapon." So in the coming 30 to 40 minutes, Rafeef will tell us more about logistical hierarchies and new forms of resistance in and through the Arabian Peninsula. After her presentation, as Alko already said, we'll do the usual Q&A, and I think Alko also already said it, but I'm going to repeat it briefly. It's going to be recorded. The questions are not going to be recorded, so no worries about that. And without further ado, thank you very much again, Rafeef, for having accepted our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you all very much for being here and sharing your Tuesday evening with us on a rainy day. I know people would rather be at a pub, so I really appreciate that you're here wanting to listen to a talk about logistics. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I have heard and seen some of the work that has happened at the Institute for years now, and I'm very jealous. I've met some of the students, the PhD students today, and I'm very excited about the vibrant and innovative research community that you are building. One that is supportive, collaborative, but also cares about the world and understanding power relations. So I'm very honored and humbled to be here in this speaker series that I think is a very good introduction to hopefully how we can dismantle some of those hierarchies within how we study regions. While what I will speak about today certainly applies to the Arabian Peninsula, I think it also impacts how we study other regions and relations of regions to each other. But let me take a back step first. COVID-19. I know the world is pretending that entire thing didn't happen, but I want to take us back to that moment to start talking about logistics. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted both the significance, but also the fragility of internationalized supply chains. With shortages in personal protective equipment, discussions of vaccine production and rollout, what some people called vaccine apartheid, and even the rush on supermarkets. I don't know if this happened here, but in the UK, there was a rush on toilet paper that was on the news for days on end. So the very largely invisible operations of business logistics suddenly became part of our daily conversations. In one of my favorite books about logistics, Deborah Cowan says that the violence of logistics is something we don't really see as consumers. We make a purchase, we don't look at the hands that made that commodity or how that commodity made it to us. So the study of logistics is basically about making this visible. And during that moment of COVID-19, the labor of those people in the transport and logistics sector, dock workers, drivers, people in warehousing and food packaging was suddenly deemed essential. These workers were forced to carry disproportionate risk to the virus because they had to go out. So we could all access commodities from the very basic necessities to the frivolous. Many of us ordered things during lockdown that God knows we didn't really need. Concurrently, the alarm over supply chain disruptions brought with it a debate about worker safety and precarity. This was graphically demonstrated by the thousands of seafarers that were simply abandoned at sea when people were no longer allowed to move. Literally, thousands of seafarers were just left months on end, deep in oceans, not being able to return home. At the same time, as this public health crisis was unfolding, logistics workers were facing unprecedented pressures. Companies like Amazon were literally making a killing. Because of all the purchases that were happening, these companies actually saw, as the crisis was happening, saw their incomes rise. This experience of the last few years has sharply highlighted how deeply our daily consumption is now mediated through business logistics. From how we organize our everyday life, every aspect is permeated with logistical thinking and the techniques of business logistics, from managing basic commodities that we consume to even organizing emergency responses to natural disasters and humanitarian relief. Yet, the rise of logistics also raises the specter of new forms of supply chain disruptions. Despite the promises of seamless trade and fully automated circulation, the pandemic, and more recently, I have to say, the war in Ukraine, with its supply shocks to the global oil and agricultural markets, has illustrated the fragility of these commodity movements and their ultimate dependence on human labor. So, why am I speaking about logistics and how does this relate to my geographical area of research, which is the Arabian Peninsula? As this seminar series is engaged with questions of knowledge production and post-colonial hierarchies, I want to point to three persistent issues that seem to continue to plague knowledge production around the Arabian Peninsula. And I want to argue that when we study infrastructures and trade infrastructures in particular and logistics, this is one way that we can help to address these three persistent issues. The first one is a persistence of Orientalism in how the Arabian Peninsula is viewed. This tends to limit how scholars engage with the region. There's a focus on Orientalist tropes, sheikhs and intrigue, stories of rags to riches, tents to high-rises, and a fascinating intrigue with royal families. Even as I was trying to put together the PowerPoint for this presentation, all the images that I was given were of camels or oil wells. So even Microsoft was trying to legitimate the point I'm trying to make here about the Orientalism and the Orientalist tropes we still continuously see in the study of the Arabian Peninsula. Then there is a persistent state-centric, or what I would call a methodological nationalism, where the focus is on individual states. So we have very deep analysis of individual states, or a larger focus on Western relations to states within the Arabian Peninsula, rather than looking at the region as a region itself, and rather than understanding its relationships with neighboring regions. And I'm stressing this because you will see in the story of logistics, there is a rewriting of a map of relations between the Arabian Peninsula and African states. And finally, and this is one of my pet peeves, let's say, is a persistence of a singular focus on oil as the driver of all regional politics when it comes to the region. So this tends to limit our understanding of other things happening in the political economy of those states. When you're just looking at oil, you're not really seeing how this oil is being used, what other industries are emerging. This is not to say that oil is not important. Of course, oil is important. Oil is the engine that keeps most economies going. So of course, it's an important thing to consider. The problem I am pointing to, however, is when it becomes the only lens by which we look at these states, not considering others or not considering how oil rents are being used and circulated in an economy. So I want to suggest, in a nutshell, what I want to suggest is that focusing on the politics of infrastructures and investments in transport infrastructures is a helpful way to move us beyond these shortcomings. So Bruce Robbins famously said that understanding logistics helps an infrastructure, looking at infrastructure, helps us to understand how these infrastructures were built, but also contestation into the future. One thing you will hear often in critical infrastructure studies is that infrastructure is usually invisibilized. We only recognize it when it stops working. If you try to turn on your tap and there's no water, that's when you realize that the infrastructure is not working. So this black boxing of infrastructure. So this is why we often don't understand these big networks and how they function. Maybe the engineers in the room sometimes do, and it tends to be more on the technical side rather than the social science side. So I guess what I'm arguing is that social scientists really need to engage with the politics of infrastructures. And this helps us to understand places like the Arabian Peninsula. Studying things like airports, ports, roads, focusing on circulation allows us to trace a different map of regional power relations, one that is attentive to rising regional powers and overlapping logistical networks that serve in the arena of trade, aid, and militarism. And one thing you notice very quickly when you start to look at these logistical networks is that they actually function for trade, aid, and militarism all at the same time. So the idea that we have trade on one hand, humanitarian work on the other, and then militarism or military basis on the other has simply largely collapsed. A lot of those spaces work across these three areas simultaneously. Additionally, when we move beyond a state city-centered approach, if we do what many geographers have asked us to do and try a vertical analysis of what's happening in the sky, what's happening underneath, when we look at circulation, this really allows us to also center social relations within this industry that is often hidden and often unseen. So ports, I don't know how many of you have been to a port. Very often, we don't see these spaces, we don't know how they function. This allows us to move from just looking at the state as the only holder of power or where politics happens to trace social relations. What emerges, to go back to the topic of this seminar series, is a plurality of hierarchies at work that go largely hidden in post-colonial settings, where the global south as a category is not a static entity, but actually a dynamic, continuously contested space where regional actors continue to vie for power, where we need to take the state seriously, but also analyze corporate power very seriously. There's a tendency within studies of globalization and corporate power to either focus on US corporations, European corporations, and nowadays more Chinese corporations. While these middle states, like the ones in the Arabian Peninsula, thinking about Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, usually people don't even think about the corporations that are as active and as large as the ones that we normally think of when it comes to logistics. So I am thinking more of a map of circulation where you look at the world differently than looking at it simply from state to state, looking at movement. And when we look at movement, and this is, by the way, the movement of container ships, you start to see where trade is happening in the world. You start to see a map of trade, a map of movement, a map of circulation that tells us about power quite differently than when we are simply looking at singular states. So let me again take a step back and speak about this logistics revolution. I've been speaking about circulation and logistics. What is this logistics revolution that I'm referring to? And why do I think you should all be interested in it? So there's a burgeoning critical literature among researchers, but also trade union activists that has stressed this science of business logistics, the management of commodity circulation through networked, complex infrastructures and internationalized supply chains, which underpins contemporary capitalism. Of course, attempts to expand, speed up, and coordinate commodity circulation at a global scale is not new. We have always had trade. So what is different about the logistics revolution is that what we have had since the 1960s is an intensification and an internationalization of trade to unprecedented levels. The 60s and 70s was undoubtedly a significant turning point in the standardization of circulation and management of goods in motion. And there are two techno-scientific reasons that underlie this. They're not the only ones, but they are what shows how we got to this map of the world that is a map of circulation, trade gateways, corridors, and logistics clusters. One of those was, of course, the container. And although it's a simple fact that we kind of live with today, that there is a box that carries commodities, this was a significant change in being able to move things from a ship onto a train, onto a road, what today is called intermodality. And this was a simple creation of a box. The simple idea of a box has allowed for trade to happen in this way. Although this is seemingly technical, business logistics is more than just the set of management techniques that help companies move things from one place to another. They are actually the organizing mechanism of what Singh has termed supply chain capitalism. Or as Lali Khalili has succinctly puts it, maritime trade, logistics, and hydrocarbons transport are the clearest distillation of how global capitalism operates today. A crucial dimension, of course, of this logistics revolution is the techno-scientific innovations that underpinned it, that helped to standardize trade in order for these supply chains to operate. So very simply put, when we order any product today, whether it's shoes or whether it's a phone, most of the time it will be assembled in multiple places. It will be moved from one place to another. That movement, that aspect of production and distribution is what a logistics chain does. It's coordinated and organized to get us these commodities from the beginning of the production onto the movement, onto the distribution. This backdrop of logistics acted to integrate new markets and manage commodity circulation, adding extreme pressure on labor, of course, to be more agile, more flexible, more lean. And these are a lot of the words you will hear in the business industry. We need lean supply chains. We need agile labor in order to speed up the circulation of these commodities. It is often noted that this industry, this logistics industry, is intimately connected to militarism. The container itself is an innovation that came from the Vietnam War. The container itself is innovation that started in the Vietnam War with the idea of moving supplies as fast as possible to the front lines. And business logistics continues to be permeated with questions of surveillance, security. So in the business industry, you will hear this terminology very often, securitizing supply chains. The security of the supply chain is the most important thing, and you will hear it in the political sphere as well. This is basically the security of circulation. There's a lot more to say on this, but for now, I just wanted to point to this connection between militarism and logistics because it's not something new that happens out of the blue. It is very much at the basis of this industry. Another techno-scientific innovation at the heart of logistics was, of course, computer modeling. So people tend to focus on the container, but it was also computer models that helped to trace the movement of commodities and ensure that they can be always tracked in time as they are moving. There are authors like Campling and Colas, of course, who have noted that a lot of the contemporary writing on logistics tends to be very presentist. It tends to look at the moment of logistics, and their argument, which I agree with, is that this kind of logistics revolution is rooted in much longer histories, much longer colonial and imperial histories, and change to the maritime industry. This is why I always tell students and social scientists to not just look at the land, but very importantly, look at the sea. You cannot understand colonialism, you cannot understand imperialism without understanding the shifts that happened in seas and oceans. That power dynamics and those systems of oppression that were created around oceans are very much still largely what structures that industry to this day. So in their analysis, Campling and Colas, that is, the origins of seamless logistics lie not in container ships per se, but in the interpretation of national capitals and interfirm alliances linking colonial and non-colonial shipping and port complexes for acceleration and reliability in the transfer of commodity capital against organized labor. They posit that shifts in bulk and tanker shipping actually preceded containerization. So before we even talk about containerization, we need to think about bulk and tanker shipping. Of course, bulk shipping was at the core of so much of how colonialism operated. If we're thinking about the goods of colonialism, if we're thinking about sugar, coffee, and those kinds of products. So all of this to say that I think the shift to end-to-end logistics is not necessarily a completely new system. It is simply an acceleration of this speeding up of commodity circulation. This has involved noticeable moves towards integrating a whole system approach of managing commodities from production, transport, storage into the market. So what logistics does is really integrate this entire chain rather than thinking about it separately. Logistics thus encompasses a wide range of activities, including the management and planning of supply chains, operation of infrastructures, etc. Why does all of this matter? It really matters because in the last 2 decades, we have really seen a change in how maritime ports are operating and in the corporate consolidation and vertical integration of the industry. Maritime shipping and ports are critical within this broader logistical architecture of commodity circulation. Around 70% of all trade actually happens in oceans. Although often social scientists don't think about oceans, that is where most commodity circulation is happening. So we need to understand this industry and how it operates. Most of what we consume reaches us through the movement of goods across oceans. In this respect, the internationalization of capital is in large part actually the story of the sea. Today, the majority of global trade in manufactured commodities is carried in container ships, while bulk carriers transport essential raw materials such as iron ore and coal, and then tankers transport crude oil, chemicals, and petroleum products. When you put all of this together, it is essentially all the materials that we as human society are consuming today. Most megaports will actually have a mix of all of these. They will have a spot for tankers, they will have a spot for container ships. A complex array of shipping companies, port operators, and different kinds of labor underpin this movement of commodities. Over recent decades, there has been a very significant eastward shift in maritime trade. So if we want to look at global political economy, one of the ways to trace it is through the movement of ships. And one thing that we clearly see in the past few decades is this shift eastwards, reflecting, of course, the movement of the center of world manufacturing to China and East Asia. In 2021, the 5 countries with the highest liner shipping connectivity, meaning the ships were the most connected to others, were in Asia. They were China, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Just a few decades ago, this would not have been the case. This is because most manufacturing is now happening in these zones. At port level, 8 of the most connected ports were also in Asia, led by Shanghai. The remaining 2 are in Europe, your neighbors in Rotterdam and Antwerp, which are the central 2 ports for the European continent. Now, this is where the largest ships are moving. It is from Asian ports that much of the world's commodity production is moved to North America and Europe, with the largest container ships and most densely used shipping routes tracking Asia, Europe, and Asia, North America. Now, this is very interesting for those of us invested in trade and consumption, because this also gives us a map of consumption. So most production is happening in these zones in East Asia, but consumption is still happening in Europe and North America, the majority of consumption. So when we have debates today, for example, about climate change and climate debt, we have to center this fact that although these countries are producing, the majority of consumption is still occurring in these zones. This map of logistics also tells us which countries are less connected. So in contrast to this trade route, you will see that the Africa and Latin America are much less connected to these global routes. As a matter of fact, if you hear the World Bank and the IMF, they're creating indices in order for countries in Latin America and Africa to be more connected. So ports, maritime ports, become these ideas, these imaginings of development in terms of opening up trade. And the story that we are all familiar with is that trade is a route to development. But for this story of trade to be development to occur, you need the infrastructures for trade to happen. So before the talk of commodities, there is also the talk of building the infrastructures of extraction. And this is how we have to think about it, the extractivist industry. And I will end with a quote later on by Walter Rodney that puts this in perspective. In this manner, as states are inserted differentially into the structures of global trade, we see a clear hierarchy of mega ports emerging along these core trade routes, influenced by state and corporate investment patterns, as well as technological factors like the ship size and the level of automation. So these largest, what is so-called mega ports, are where the largest ships are stopping. What has occurred in the logistics industry is also that these container ships are now the largest we have seen historically. Some people call them moving factories. Just in the last few decades, we have had an increase in the size of these ships to almost 125%. So we are speaking about giant mammoth factories that are moving in the oceans. I will not speak to what this means in relation to pollution, just to say that we are not speaking about small ships here, where these mega container ships. And you trace this to the cities that are, of course, emerging, where these mega ports are being built, and you can name them. Dubai is one of them. So it's interesting that in writing about the Arabian Peninsula, this question of the port and the ports is often ignored. And why I think it's very useful to center these discussions is that places like Dubai, like the United Arab Emirates, but actually the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula is all vying to build the biggest possible ports. As a matter of fact, they all have development plans. All of the development plans were largely written up by Western consultancy corporations, and all of them have the same blueprint: facilitate logistics, build infrastructures, build trade infrastructures. So at the same time, we have seen a clear tendency towards reducing unit cost by increasing ship size. We see that the size of the average port is increasing, and this is just between 2006 and 2020. Today, there is a staggering concentration of control in terms of port operators, with just 5 companies controlling 50% of container trade through ports at the world level. So think about this. We are saying that around 70 to 80% of trade globally happens in oceans. There are about 5 port operators, 5 port conglomerates that control 50% of that trade. This is a concentration of corporate power that is truly staggering. So again, you see a historical shift in the ownership of these companies. The companies today, these 5 companies I'm speaking about, are PSA International, Singapore, one of the first to pursue an international strategy, Hutchinson Port Holdings, Hong Kong, APM Terminals. Although they are headquartered in the Netherlands, this is a unit of the Danish shipping company Maersk, and of course, COSCO, which is the Chinese shipping company, and finally, Dubai Ports World. Now, when we speak about the Arabian Peninsula and simply focus on oil, we completely ignore this dynamic of one of the largest companies in the world controlling so much of the container traffic actually coming from this part of the world and expanding and having an expansionary strategy. Of course, there's a similar concentration of ownership can also be seen in the shipping industry. 65% of the container ship market is currently controlled by 5 companies. This is the actual shipping lines, not the ones who operate the ports. Those were the 5 I just spoke about. This is the actual shipping lines. And here you have a concentration of 60% of this trade. You have Mediterranean Shipping Company, it's a Swiss-Italian company, APM Maersk, Denmark, CMA CGM, France, COSCO, China, and of course you have the German one, the Lloyd one, one of the most famous and still one of the strongest in the ship line industry with a very consolidated portfolio. So when we look at this industry, there's 2 things happening: a concentration in port operators on one hand, a concentration in ship liners, and then a vertical integration taking place where the port operators are buying ship lines, where the ship lines are working together in conglomerates. Now, this gives this industry major strength, and it gives us major strength when it comes to negotiating with smaller states, whether they are in Africa, whether they are in Latin America. These companies will have the major leverage. They can simply decide that a ship line will no longer stop at a regional port, and that regional port may collapse. Such levels of concentration of corporate power should really be worrying to anyone who's interested in how the global political economy is functioning. And of course, we have had many debates about the geopolitics of this. And a lot of people are very obsessed with the geopolitics of this on the level of China, US, of course. Among the emergent port operators that I just mentioned, there is still a considerable role played by large state-owned enterprises. So of the 5 port operators that I noted earlier, 2 are majority state-owned, COSCO and Dubai Ports World. So here we actually have states that own these corporations. And I think we still have a lot of confusion in the social sciences about how to analyze these companies that are state-owned. We still have major confusion of to think of them as separate corporate entities, or are they part of the state? Certainly a lot more work has gone into the study of Chinese corporations that are state-owned. Much less has happened in the Arabian Peninsula. We've had some excellent books that talk about different industries in the Arabian Peninsula, but I think there is still theorization to be done around the link between authoritarian rule, authoritarian regimes, and how they are connected to these corporations with such large portfolios. Sometimes we have a tendency to collapse them into each other and to say, this is the state is operating in this way. However, when you look at how these companies behave, they have very much an outward look, an internationalization look. So there is a line we need to think about here in this relationship and theorization of these companies. Of course, the major example of this in contemporary time has been a focus on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which, as people say, accelerated an ongoing trend increasing Chinese investment in overseas ports that began in the early 2000s. Led by Chinese state-owned companies and backed by a host of development banks and private banks, the project has actually already impacted transport development across the maritime sector in many countries. But similarly, the UAE, Dubai Ports World, is also a major actor in this global maritime industry, a position that is simultaneously linked to the UAE's considerable weight in the global airport industry. We have to put these two together, because when they're talking about logistics, they're not simply talking about one part of the chain, they're speaking about a complete chain. So here we are speaking about the connection between ports and airports. So one of the major companies during the pandemic, for example, that was moving containers and moving supplies around the world was Dubai Ports World, because it also had access to Emirates Airlines as well, and Abu Dhabi Airlines as well. So there is that interconnection that they are playing. Maritime infrastructures are thus a vehicle through which countries such as China and the UAE are attempting to reconfigure their place in global hierarchies of what states in the contemporary world market can do. Indeed, these transport investments are generating a multiplicity of geopolitical tensions. And those of you interested in geopolitical power, it's extremely relevant to look at infrastructures and how they operate. There has been what some people have described as an infrastructural scramble, especially in the African continent right now, that is forming and where you could really see the tensions growing in a multipolar world. For example, it's worth noting here that concern over control of infrastructures has promoted the US to establish an international development finance corporation with a mandate to consolidate the US capacity to finance infrastructures specifically. So this is the US response to investments by the Chinese government. At the same time, there are similar concerns are expressed in initiatives like the European Union's Global Gateway. So the European Union is also trying to jump into this fray and build these infrastructures and control them. In a different context, the United Arab Emirates investments in maritime infrastructures in East Africa have inserted it forcefully into local politics. So the United Arab Emirates has invested in ports along the Red Sea, in places like Somaliland, where they have strongly entered into a quibble with Somalia. And of course, we see the situation in Sudan. It is worth noting that just a few months back, the United Arab Emirates said that it was going to invest up to $6 billion in transport infrastructures in Sudan. When we look at these geopolitics of these regions, we cannot simply just look at what the United States is doing or at what China is doing. We really need to look at what these regional actors are up to, especially in light of the Arab uprisings of the 2010s and 2011. What we have seen is these regional actors interfering very vulgarly, I would say, in countries like Ethiopia, in countries like Sudan, in countries like Yemen, of course, where we have had one of the deadliest brutal wars that has caused insufferable damage to the people of Yemen. So when we look at these actors, it is not simply that places like Yemen, Sudan, or Ethiopia, it's not that they don't have their own patterns, but what we are seeing is major intervention coming from countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, this intervention comes in different forms. And we have a tendency as social scientists to look at conflict, to look at the military side of it, but these infrastructural investments have been just as central to the geopolitics of the region. And these investments in ports, like companies like Dubai World and others have been invested in, have come hand in hand with militarizing these situations as well. So we have had policing being given to these states, we have had military bases, and we have had a trade in arms coming hand in hand with these infrastructural investments. So we cannot think of infrastructure separately from militarism, and we cannot think of it separately from the geopolitics of the region. And although there is a tendency to focus solely on Chinese investments in upcoming port projects in the context of the BRI, I would argue that countries like the UAE are also keenly invested in linking up their logistical networks to African markets by strategically building up their portfolio of ports and gateways. DP World does not have a shipping arm like its competitors, so what it tends to do is invest more in terminals, in logistics, in free trade zones. The company has several projects across Africa with operations in Senegal, Mozambique, Egypt, Algeria, Rwanda, Congo, and Somaliland. We need to understand these investments, how they are operating, and what they are for. A major focus of the UAE's activities in Africa is Senegal, where DP World has been operating since 2008. The concession agreement was signed for the construction of a 1.13 billion deep water port situated 50 kilometers from Dakar. Very recently, DP World has signed an e-commerce website with Rwanda, very aptly named Do Buy, as in do purchase. Investments such as these illustrate the growing focus of the UAE on these mega infrastructural projects. We need to focus not just on what Western states are doing, but what these, maybe we can call them middle actors, I'm not attached to the term, are also doing. The language of logistics as development. So when these investments are done, we need to analyze this language and the discourse behind it, because often it is in these win-win scenarios. We have the money, we have the know-how, we are going to invest, there will be jobs in the region. And it's very difficult to argue against this when we're speaking about extremely poor regions where poverty is really high, and then this company comes and says, we want this investment. But we need to think more critically about the point of these investments and where they're coming from. So let me end on the note of labor, organizing, and disruption. There has been a lot of talk among labor activists and people working in the industry about labor in the logistics sector and how it holds a strategic position because it's able to actually disrupt supply chains. But let's take a moment to actually talk about the labor in this industry, because I think at times we tend to focus on particular kinds of labor and not others. Much of the labor involved in the maritime industry is hidden from view and strikingly concentrated in East and South Asia. At the very base of the industry is the process of actually building the ships. Here, the last decade has witnessed an extraordinary geographical concentration with just 3 countries, China, South Korea, and Japan, responsible for 94% of global shipbuilding activity in 2020. I think somebody should write an entire dissertation just on this concentration. The labor on these ships is also highly concentrated. Here I'm speaking about seafarers, with workers from the Philippines, Russia, Indonesia, China, and India making up nearly half of the global seafarer workforce. The labor involved in the end of life of ships is important, although no one likes to talk about it. So people talk about producing the ships, people talk about workers on the ships, but there's actually very little talk about what happens when these ships go to die, when they are dismantled. Here, Bangladesh and India jointly actually are responsible for dismantling around 71%, and Pakistan for the additional 17% of ship scraping. This is the tearing of the massive cargo ships apart, recycling the material when they reach the end of their life operations. This is a hugely labor-intensive process with highly unsafe working conditions. In short, human labor remains crucial to this industry, but much of it is not discussed. And again, I think there's a lot of scope to actually study this scrapping industry because it sells itself as an environmental industry. But actually, those who have documented the working conditions can tell you how horrific the working conditions are and how a lot of the laborers actually die while performing the job. Now, shipping companies, of course, are not going to advertise this. And they say, well, at the end of the ship's life, it has gone now to somewhere else. But they are as responsible for the misery that happens in the scraping of the ships. And of course, you could see from the concentration of where this is happening, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, that this is also a racialized system of where at the base of this industry, there's a racial labor regime. Elsewhere, the promotion of integrated maritime logistics is routinely couched in the language of development win-win scenarios. New port projects are promoted as job creation opportunities and investment, allowing for more efficient trade. What we don't hear in this story is the amount of land necessary and the destruction of oceans necessary to build these mega ships, these mega container ships, and to build these ports. So each port, you're actually most of the time having to blow up the ocean, literally blow up the oceans in order to have space for these big container ships to actually dock. So the environmental degradation of this industry are also worthwhile looking into and discussing. Historically, of course, maritime workers have had very high levels of unionization. They have led very important campaigns against for their working conditions, but also against militarism. They were very active in the campaign against apartheid in South Africa. There is a history of unionization of dock workers. But this militancy has also had to wane with the breakup of the industry, because what the industry has done, it has basically shifted itself to places where there is less unionization. It is not accidental in this way that the United Arab Emirates and the Arabian Gulf in general then becomes one of the hubs for this industry. For one, unionization is not allowed. Protest is not allowed. The kafala system means that people are consistently temporary and have no way of becoming permanent. So while a lot of the writing that I agree with on the logistics revolution has really centered labor and the importance of labor in disrupting these chains, we need to think of the multiplicity of labor and the different geographies and racialized labor regimes in this industry. It is not simply happening in ports where there's high unionization. It is also occurring and it is moving. And this is a very strategic move to actually expand. Although historically there have been very high levels of unionization among dock workers, providing them important leverage, the shift in global trade eastwards and the consolidation of corporate power in the maritime industry has really weakened their position. Therefore, there has been very long-term and consistent assault on workers' conditions. Beyond dock workers and seafarers, union density, of course, varies extensively across the logistics sector. Warehousing, for example, has very low unionization rates and has been marked by short-term and zero-hour contracts and growing use of digital technologies to monitor and discipline labor. In an amazing expose of Amazon warehouses in Montreal, Mustafa Hanawi explained how the company uses a badge system to create an internal temp system, leading to desperate, docile workforce among those hired as seasonal workers. There has been a lot written about Amazon recently. I'm very happy to chat about it. What's important for us to consider, though, is that within the logistics industry, there are very different labor regimes and very different tempos of work. Seafarers may be out at sea for 6 months, while warehouse workers are in warehouses on short-term temporary contracts. Ideally, what a lot of people writing about this are talking about is an ability to be able to organize workers across this supply chain. But that is a very difficult task. One, because of the concentration of corporate power, but two, because of the segmentation of these sectors. So dock workers work on the docks, but then truck drivers are unionized under a different union, and it's very difficult to bring this together. A lot of organizers have talked about organizing the so-called last mile drivers, delivery drivers, Amazon warehouse drivers. And there is very interesting work happening in that sector, but it needs to be linked up with the entire logistics chain. Before I lose everyone, I wanted to end with this quote by Walter Rodney, because I think it really takes us back to what infrastructures are about. And remember here, he's writing even before, like we're just at the cusp of this logistics revolution, but he's speaking about infrastructure historically. I don't know about you over here, but in the UK, anytime somebody brings up colonialism, the counter argument to why colonialism was bad is that colonialism brought infrastructures to the colonized, bought trains. And I had never heard this argument, being from a colonized place myself, but it is an argument that people make with a straight face, that colonialism at least brought infrastructure. And here, Walter Rodney is taking apart this conceptualization of infrastructure that when we actually look at it during colonialism, it was about extractivism. Most of the infrastructure that was built, including trains, was about taking products out into the sea. And I wonder how much of this infrastructural logic of colonialism is not simply replicating itself. I spoke about organizing and trade union organizing. I'll end by saying that disruption of supply chains is also one of the key ways that social movements have also been trying to act. If you look at indigenous movements, whether across Latin America or in places like Canada, they have used disruption of supply chains. A few years ago, when Israel was attacking Gaza yet another time, there was a Block the Boat campaign, and social movement activists plus trade unions worked together to make sure that ships and goods on the Zim ship, which is an Israeli shipping company, could not be moved. And many trade unions, including ones in South Africa, actually responded to the call from Palestine and made sure that they did not actually touch goods and did not actually move or handle these containers. This was a really big moment of action where we saw social movements and trade unions working together hand in hand to actually make a point of stopping militarism. So there is a huge potential for working within the logistics sector for social movements, whether we are speaking about militarism, or I think in the coming years, our actions around climate change will really have to take a serious look at infrastructures and how we stop oil tankers from moving. I think this is a very interesting arena to study. If you're thinking about your PhD or your master's, I encourage you to look into it. And when you hear about infrastructures, don't just look at the fun discourses of development, but actually ask yourself the question that underlies it. What are the power relations? What is being extracted? Who is it going to? And what is the corporate power? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafeef. That was a really great lecture with quite some food for thought. I would personally have a ton of questions, but I'm just going to hold myself and give the floor to you. I would suggest we take questions 3 at a time and then give Rafeef some time to respond to them in a collected way. Who wants to go first? And if I could just ask you